This
RAIB.
conference will now be recorded.
So yeah, I'm one of the inspectors at RAIB. My background, as Brian has just alluded to, is in track. So I've worked for maintenance and for S&C renewals for a number of years. I did a few years with Pandrel, doing some of their technical support. And then before I joined RAIB, for 5 years, I worked at Nottingham Tram as their track asset manager. So kind of like a RAM and a TME combined. And then for 5 years now, I've been at RAIB. And at RAIB, I'm the kind of lead on P-Way and track, particularly plain line. And more recently, I've taken on the kind of track worker safety side of it as well. And also help out with things like surveying and some of the more technical bits around civil engineering as well. So that's my background. It's fairly standard in terms of track, but it's always been in that kind of field. So today's presentation, if you've been on the track engineering diploma or you've seen one of these before, some of this will be familiar to you. I apologise that there will be a little bit of repetition for what you've seen before, but hopefully there'll be some interesting things for you. And thank you to Brian. Yeah, I may have to have a break for a second to have a cough because I'm feeling the effects of COVID a bit today. But please bear with me if that happens. So I want to take you back about 20 years. About 20 years ago was around the time of privatisation, rail track, and that era. Coincidentally, it's about the time I joined the industry, but I don't think that's a correlation. It was quite a difficult time for our industry. There were a number of quite high-profile railway accidents. You will recognise, I'm sure, some, if not all, of that list on the left. And the graph on the right is the kind of fatalities that happened to the members of the public in and around our railway. And the one that will stick out immediately to you is in 1999 was the So this is on the way out of Paddington. Two trains head-on collision resulted in 31 people losing their life, over 500 injuries. This was a huge, huge accident. And this prompted a major public inquiry. And that public inquiry was led by a gentleman called Lord Cullen. And that inquiry was split into two halves. The first half of that inquiry was, why did the accident happen? Very much a kind of traditional accident investigation. But the second half of that inquiry was more focused on the railway industry, looking at how come the railway industry is in this mess, effectively, and what can we do? And if you remember that time, there was a body known as the Her Majesty's Railway Inspectorate, who were pretty much ubiquitous across the industry. They were involved in various stages of the industry, from approvals to standard setting to safety cases and accident investigation. And one of the things here is, unlike other transport industries like the air industry or the marine industry, there wasn't an independent accident investigation body. So you could end up with a situation where the HMRI could be investigating things that they've done. And while that isn't, we're not accusing anyone of anything, that isn't an ideal scenario. So Lord Cullen's report resulted in the 2003 Railways and Transport Safety Act, and that effectively broke up the HMRI's kind of all-encompassing jurisdiction. And this is simplified, there's more depth to it than this, but let's keep it simple today. On the one hand, some of that responsibility got split out, the Office of Rail and Road, or was the Office of Rail Regulation at the time. They are the industry regulators. So you will have heard last week, if you were here, from Matt, excellent presentation about the LRR's function. And they're regulating the health and safety of the railway, but also its performance. But HMRI inspectors still exist. They still exist within the LRR, but it's very much looking at health and safety at work type things. So if you think HSE book for the railway, you're not a million miles away. Another function that's split off from that is standard setting and some of the research and development work, and that is all kind of factored into RSSB. And I'm fairly sure at some point we'll have a similar presentation about their work. And then there's our agency, which is the So we are purely here for accident investigation, and we're independent of the other bodies. I'll talk a bit about what our function is in a minute. So our purpose, our mission statement, if you will, is the investigation of accidents and incidents with two main aims. The first one is to improve railway safety. That is our big headline aim. But the second one is a little bit more subtle, but just as important, and that is to inform the public. Now, it's not just the public, it's the industry as well. But back in the days of, say, the Ladbroke Grove inquiry, that was a massive public inquiry, took a very long time, cost the taxpayer an awful lot of money. But the key thing is the findings from that were made public. And we still kind of go down that route. So everything we do is made public. And for various reasons. First of all, that shows that we take safety seriously as an industry, and there's no kind of cloak and dagger stuff going on here. Everything we produce is made fully available to everyone. As I said before, we're fully independent of other parties. We're nominally part of the DFT, although we can effectively investigate our own bosses or bite the hand that feeds, or whatever you want to do, however you want to put it. So we do not have any association with any party in the industry at all. And a key thing is that we do not apportion blame or liability. So we're not worried about whose fault it is or who has to pay. We are purely here to do a safety investigation to understand how we can stop this happening again. A little bit about our scope of work. We cover all of Network Rail. So right from the very north of Scotland and Wick and there, all the way down to Cornwall, and everything in between. So wherever it is, so you've got Loch Ealt on the left, which is near Fort William, Grey Rig, which many of you will recognise, and Watford Tunnel on the right, which will. But it's not just Network Rail. We also cover other systems. So the light rail sector, many of you will recognise the Sandilands tram on the left. One of our most prominent investigations of the RARB's lifetime, and one of the most tragic. But we also cover the metro systems, LU, Glasgow Subway, Tyne Weir, Merseyrail, these kind of other systems. So anything you think in passenger carrying rail vehicles, whatever that may be. Channel Tunnel we cover to the halfway point, where it hands over to our French colleagues, although we do work very closely with Bayat, who are our French equivalent. So even if it happens on their side, we'll work together, and likewise, if it happens on our side, we'll get them involved. So there's a good working relationship there. And we cover the heritage sector. So not every heritage line is in scope. The kind of the point it becomes in scope is when it starts interfacing with traffic, roads, level crossings, bridges. So if a public road crosses the heritage line at any point, then it becomes in scope. So the big ones, this Severn Valley, Great Central, North York Walls, those big ones, but also things like the Festiniog and Welsh Highland are in, and essentially all the main heritage lines are in scope for us.
Jonathan, sorry to interrupt here. Just Joe. Jonathan, there seems to be a little problem with the sound, just going in and out a little bit. I don't know if it's the way you've got your microphone, maybe. We can't hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Same here. It keeps breaking up in between,
Yeah.
It's not continuous.
Okay. I've just shut down.
You're gone again, Jonathan.
Okay, I don't know what that is, Jan. Let me shut down my.
I think it depends on where I'm not having too much trouble at this end, to be honest. So perhaps it's variable around the call. Let's press on. Let's press on and see how we go.
Is that any better, anyone? Sorry, obviously I can't tell if it's working or not.
That seems okay to me. Just crack on and we'll see how we go.
All right, thank you, Brian. So when do we investigate? Now, I mentioned the 2003 Railways and Transport Safety Act earlier. That dictates when we must investigate. And there's these kind of various criteria, which if there's a derailment or a collision, so it's involving a moving train as the first thing, and it results in someone losing their life or serious injury to 5 or more people, or extensive damage to the infrastructure or the rolling stock. And by extensive damage, we're talking about £2 million, €2 million, around that mark. Then we will investigate it every time. But then the right-hand box is the kind of near-miss criteria. So we get that kind of thing where, well, if this was slightly different, this could quite easily have caused serious injury to a lot of people. This quite easily could have killed someone. So if that's the case, then we have our ability to use our discretion. So we will look at how serious the incident is. We will look at whether there's safety learning to be had. I will talk about that process a little bit in a few slides' time. But the key thing is, if it is a serious railway accident, then the likelihood is we will investigate it. A little bit about how we're organised. The Chief Inspector is the head honcho, obviously. He reports directly to the Secretary of State. Now, that is the official link. Obviously, we are part of the Department of Transport, and there is a whole host of functions that we use them for. So it's not a direct phone to the Secretary of State every time. But the key thing is, for the purpose of the regulations, that is the link. The Chief Inspector is in charge of two primary teams. The Deputy Chief Inspector's team is the Inspectorate, which is where I sit. And then there's a business support function which deal with things like our governance, our communications, publications, operational support, etc. The head of joint policy is a shared resource, as is the head of external comms. We share that resource with our colleagues in air and marine. We work very closely with them, and the head of joint policy makes sure that the three branches are working together quite well. The Inspectorate side, we're split into 4 teams, 2 at Derby, 2 at Farnborough. I'm part of one of the Derby teams, but essentially we share resource, we help each other out. It's not a fixed thing, it's just in terms of organisation and keeping track of investigations. That's how we are set up. As I say, we have 2 bases at Derby and Farnborough. Now, it seems a bit weighted towards the south, but the reality is the vast majority of our railway is in the southeast. Around London, there is so much more track mileage than there is elsewhere around the country. So that setup actually works quite well. If we get a deployment in the far north of Scotland somewhere, then the Derby inspectors might jump in the van and start driving. But meanwhile, we might actually get a couple of Farnborough inspectors to jump on a plane from Heathrow and get up there even quicker, because that's the reality of how we deploy. So however we need to get there, we will get there. Also note, we cover Northern Ireland. So if something happens in Northern Ireland, there's not really much of an option but to jump on a plane, because the idea of going to Holyhead and getting a ferry and all that kind of business will just be too slow in a kind of day-to-day basis. At all times, we've got a number of on-call staff. At a minimum, it's 5. Normally, it's a few more. And those 5 are 2 at each office, and then what we call a duty coordinator. The duty coordinator is the person at the end of a phone who is fielding those calls to decide what we're going to do. So the duty coordinator doesn't go to site. They're very much the kind of eyes and ears of the branch, filtering things to decide what we need to do. Our inspectors come from quite a broad range of backgrounds. The majority are ex-rail industry. Like myself, I'm from the track industry, but we've got people from signalling, rolling stock. We've got people from heritage experience. More increasingly, we've been looking at people with things like investigation, incident management, and human factors, as opposed to traditional engineering, because we're finding that an awful lot of our investigations have got real key human factors elements to them, as much as kind of nuts and bolts and kind of engineering I'm used to. But regardless of your background, we're all trained to be good generalists across the board. So regardless of where you are coming into the branch, we go through an extensive training program over a couple of years where we get a good basic knowledge of all of these things. So, I never thought I'd have to know the intricacies of signalling systems, but, we go through that training. But we also do training on how to run a site, forensic recovery, family liaison, interviewing. So actually how to conduct ourselves on site and undertake things to the standard you would expect. We have that underpinning knowledge throughout the inspectorate. The key thing I always think about with us, though, is that we always should know the right question to ask to people. So regardless if I'm talking to a signalling engineer or if I'm talking to a rolling stock engineer, even though that's not my background, I should have enough knowledge to be able to ask the right questions to get the right information. To allow us to do that, we have a number of legal powers. In some ways similar to the police, in some ways a little bit more powerful in our kind of in our sphere of influence. So we can enter property, whether that be railway property or adjacent, or indeed we can enter any property without warrant if we feel that is important. I wouldn't just use that for the sake of it. We have to genuinely think there's a reason we need to be there. But we actually have the power to enter property for that and seize evidence regardless of what that might be. So if a big piece of train's landed in your back garden, then we have the power to come in and get that, for instance. We also have we're also allowed to make records, photos, videos, all that kind of thing. We can interview people, and interestingly, we can compel them to answer. So this is unlike, you're not being interviewed under caution. We're not here to establish blame or liabilities or to accuse you of anything. So if we do interview you, no comment isn't an option. If you actually say no comment, you're breaching the law. So that's actually something you're not allowed to do, and you could be in trouble for not answering our questions, which is a bit strange when people are used to seeing line of duty or something. But no, the idea of a no comment interview with us really doesn't cut it. As well as that, we will take a vast variety of evidence. Now, at its most difficult, if someone has lost their life, then we may well work with the coroner to either attend or at least get the information from post-mortem. We will look at more technical evidence, so you look at data loggers, the OTDR, the black box of the train, CCTV, site surveys, etc., etc. We've got our own drone pilots. We've got 4 of those, so we do an awful lot with drone surveys now, and they're an excellent way of getting a lot of information very quickly. But in slow time, we might actually, we'll trawl through maintenance records, we'll do lab tests, we'll go and take things to various labs around the country as necessary. If we need to test something, we'll find a way of doing it. That's the key thing. Now, how do we decide what to do? Not every investigation we do is mandated. I won't go through the whole flowchart here, but the key thing is some important questions we ask ourselves. The first thing is it a mandatory investigation? In which case, yes, we'll do it because we have to by law. Then we ask ourselves such things as, did it have severe consequences? Is there going to be important safety learning, or do we think there is? And there's various routes that will lead us to doing investigation. We have other options. If someone's lost their life, but it's not looking like there'll be safety learning, we may well just write to the coroner. If we look at this and we think there is safety learning, but we've seen it before, we may well write what we call a safety digest. And that is a summary of what happened, and then some signposting to previous investigations we've done where we say, this has happened before, these are the investigations, you can go and find out the kind of more detailed background behind this. So there's various options to us. Although standard investigations, of course, are kind of the one that we're most known for. Preparing an investigation is quite a long-winded process. I'm sure many of you know it does take quite a bit of time from us going to site to us producing a report. That's because this has to be absolutely bomb-proof. This is in place of public inquiry. This is in place of getting people into court. So we really need to make sure we get this right first time. So there is an evidence phase where we hoover up all the evidence on site and we start pulling that together. But then the analysis phase where we take that evidence and actually look at it and decide what it really means. And we do testing, we do lab work, we'll do an awful lot of analysis reviews, looking at how do these pieces of the jigsaw really fit together? Have we missed anything? Do we need to go back out and find it? When that's done, we'll draft a report. There's a lot of internal kind of stage gates we go through, and then it goes to a consultation with the affected parties. That consultation process is again mandated by law, and if you're an organisation or you as an individual are involved, you will get sight of what we're proposing before it becomes public knowledge. So you don't get this kind of bolt out the blue where you're just like, oh my, I never knew this was going to be going out. We consult with you throughout and make sure that nothing comes as a major surprise, because we're not here to pull the rug out from under anyone's feet. All we really care about is making good safety recommendations to prevent this happening again. And obviously, once we've been through that whole process, the final report will get published, and then we'll review how it went and how we can improve for next time, or if there's anything we need to do to improve this process. The output from all this is recommendations. The responsibility for following up our recs lies with the ORR. And it's a bit strange in that way, but we've got a good working relationship with the ORR. We sometimes have our little kind of tussles over a recommendation here or there, but that's only natural. And if we don't feel that that recommendation has been followed up as we intended, then we have a route through the ORR where we can raise that. The key thing is, if we make a recommendation on your company or on your organisation, you've kind of really got two options. You either implement it, or if you're not going to implement it, you need to come up with a good justification why, or maybe why you've done it by a different route or something like that. So you have a duty to at least consider it and provide justification if you can't, or you're going to do it a different way, for instance. And that all goes through the ORR. A snapshot of what we're investigating at the moment. This is our current list of ongoing investigations. We'll talk a little bit about a couple of them. We'll talk particularly about the one at the bottom, which is Carmont, which is obviously about 18 months ago now, but it's a massive investigation and our biggest one at the moment by far. But you will see the kind of things we're looking at here. We've got a couple of tram ones, we've got some buffer stop collisions, we've got some derailments, etc., etc. We'll talk about some themes. Let's talk about Carmont. Carmont is our largest ongoing investigation and one of our largest investigations to date. Just to summarise kind of where we are with it, well, what happened. I'm sure many of you will remember this summer a couple of years ago, 18 months ago now. A HST travelling from Stonehaven down towards the south of Scotland turned back because of a landslide south of Carmont, and on its return trip to Stonehaven, it hit some material that's washed out, which you can see on the top right. Travelling at speed, the train derailed. The three people lost their life in this accident. It could have been an awful lot worse. The train was very lightly loaded with passengers. There were only a handful of people on board. If this had been outside of COVID times, this would have been a much more packed service. It was a 4 carriages, 2 power cars. The first power car went down the bank. The driver unfortunately lost his life. One of the carriages went down the bank. 2 of the carriages flipped. The rearmost carriage and the rear power car stayed fairly upright. It was a terrible accident. We are currently consulting on this with affected parties, and I'm sure you can understand there's quite a lot of affected parties here. So that is proving to be a very difficult and a very complex investigation. Hopefully you should be seeing that report in the next few months. And there is an interim report available on our website if you want to know some more information about the history of kind of the infrastructure there and what kind of the initial findings in the investigation. That's available to you. But the washout material came from a drain that had been installed a few years back, and during some rather intense rainfall, that was enough to funnel down some of the geographical features there, and the water pressure was enough to wash material onto the track. So yeah, a very difficult and a very tragic accident, and very much the focus of the branch at the moment. It was only a couple of weeks later, there was this dramatic derailment in South Wales at Morlays Junction. Not so much a tragedy in terms of people losing their life, but an environmental tragedy. And you can see the 2 wagons on the side there, which are all burnt out. There was a huge oil fire here, we've seen for miles and miles around, and also a lot of fuel spillage into an area of, I'm not sure if it's a triple SI, or certainly an area of natural beauty in this area here. We have just released a report to this in the last few days. It's worth reading, primarily down to issues with wagon maintenance, and what some of the recommendations we made from this are focused on looking at how wagon maintenance is done. Some real challenges to the industry here. Not been an easy report for some people to read. Basically, one of the wheel sets had locked up. It caused a false flange on one of the wheels, and when it got to Morlane's junction, that was enough that that wagon with the false flange was sent the wrong way effectively, and the derailment occurred. Some other themes. This is a graph I've shown in some of the other presentations before, kind of to show the kind of things to deal with. I think there might be a couple of the most recent investigations which aren't really factored in here, but the story is pretty much the same. You can see the kind of things which feature on our headlines mostly. Track worker incidents I'll talk about in a second. They've been a headline thing for us. I know obviously a great passion of people like Nick Millington, who has spoken to the PWI numerous occasions, and I'm sure will in the future. But also some of the classic ones, should we say, level crossings, derailments, are pretty much the bread and butter of the REIB really. We've seen a fair number of non-stops and runaways, some dispatch problems, etc., etc. The other column on the right contains all kinds of weird and wonderful things, because we do often get things which you just don't really pigeonhole nicely into any of these categories. Let's cover track workers a little bit. Track worker incidents are a big thing on my radar, because I lead this for the REIB, but you will notice this is only in the last few years. These are things that these are track worker near misses or worse accidents, which have been serious enough that the REIB have been interested. There are numerous more accidents which have taken place. And if you look, that is already quite a long list for what is only a few years. Those that are highlighted in bold and green are unfortunately those where our colleagues have lost their lives. You will know the names of those in particular. Margam, I'll talk about in a second. This is a serious ongoing problem, and one to which we've been challenging Network Rail and other agencies, for instance, PLAW is Tyne and Weir, but Network Rail in particular, we've really been pushing them on this for a number of years now. And this is why, these are our friends, our colleagues, these are people who should have gone home safe, who have lost their life on the railway. And again, that time around the turn of the millennium, when we were seeing fairly high profile train accidents, we've also seen quite a few of our colleagues being struck and killed. And things started to improve, or so it seemed. And then all of a sudden, in the last few years, we've seen a bit of an upturn. So 2018, Stoke-Ness, 2019, Margam, and you've got Rose and Surbiton. This is becoming worryingly frequent again, shall we say. Margam is the one that many of you will know best. Two very long-standing members of our railway family. People that were known to us, and certainly one of these guys was a PWI member as well. These are people that have been around the railway all their working life and got struck and killed by a GWR train. If you only read one REIB report, this is the one to read. So that's how passionate I am about this one, because this really challenges the way we work. And Network Rail, to their credit, have taken the lessons from Margam very seriously and are making sweeping changes. And we're hoping that some of the signs of those changes are coming through now, and things are looking like they've improved. We are hoping that that improvement is sustained. I think the reason we're a bit cautious is obviously Surbiton, another member of maintenance got killed at Surbiton after Margam, and some of the learning from Margam doesn't seem to have really filtered into the grassroots of the industry quite as quickly as we'd hoped. So I think there's still a way to go, but things are hopefully looking better. A few other common themes for us: passenger train interface as the technical term, but kind of how trains and the travelling platform interfaces. Couple of ones to have a look at if you're interested. Waterloo, you can see this on the underground. You can see the rather large gaps between the doors and the platform, but in particular mid-car, you can see quite a large gap between the platform and the side of the train. And someone indeed went down one of those gaps. You know what, I mean, many of you who've been around London will know how crowded these platforms can get. This actually happened on a very quiet platform, but you know, a key risk there for our colleagues on the underground. And Eden Park, a gentleman who was partially sighted, strayed down and fell down onto the railway, and noticed the lack of tactiles there. But also there's some really interesting lessons to learn at Eden Park regarding how we respond to accidents, how the emergency services respond. So 2 reports worth reading if that's something that interests you. 2 ongoing investigations we've got at the moment around buffer stop collisions, and one at Kirby, which is up in Merseyside, and more recently at Enfield. You know, looking at how drivers behave, looking at how the infrastructure can contain these kind of accidents. So some interesting things that are hopefully going to come out of those 2 investigations. We've had a couple of fairly high-profile freight train derailments in recent times. Eastleigh was first, and then more recently Sheffield. Big freight train issues causing major disruption, but actually the root of both these accidents comes down to managing the infrastructure. So both of these happened on areas where the track failed underneath the train effectively, and failures that weren't really known about by the local staff and hadn't been picked up by track recording vehicles. So how do we manage those kind of hidden failures and those failures that maybe we don't see day to day? I say level crossings are a fairly regular customer for us. User work crossings in particular, where people don't phone or people cross safely because they don't know what they're doing. And working around them. I mean, staff working around level crossings becomes a big thing for us as well. Mucking on the right, concrete mixer on an AHB, and the barrier came down while the mixer was actually half across the crossing because he didn't go all the way across. He was pulling onto the crossing and then trying to back up. So yeah, some difficulties around working around level crossings that people maybe don't think about. I say we go back to Watford. It's always one I include because it's quite interesting for many reasons. A 350, the 350 on the right in the top right-hand picture derailed on this landslip. Up behind that palisade fence at the top is the Harry Potter Studios. If you know that area, a lot of water came down during a rather large rain event, and that essentially washed material down onto the track and derailed the oncoming train. Now, that was going into a tunnel, and another train was coming into the tunnel from the other end, and we were heading for what would be a head-on collision inside a tunnel, which is pretty much the nightmare scenario for a train accident. Fortunately, the 6-foot rail of the track it was on, the track the derailed train was on, got wedged between the traction motor and the gearbox. You can see in the bottom right-hand picture, there's a kind of 4-inch gap between those 2 bits of equipment, and the rail kind of went in there and guided the train. So it kind of, a bit like a scale electric car or something, it guided the train, stopped it straying too far over onto the other track. And so actually only ended up being a glancing blow as opposed to a proper head-on collision. We're very, very, very lucky as an industry there. What's interesting here is the landslide itself. It happened because there was a crest drain at the top of the embankment, which had become blocked over time. People had forgotten it was there. It wasn't being maintained properly. And sure enough, in this big rain event, it wasn't able to cope with all the rain, so it spilled down the embankment. But what's interesting is to the left of that landslip, you can see that brick structure. That's an area, that's a wall that was built because of a previous landslip failure at this location. But I think it was about 100 years ago. It's a very historic piece of infrastructure that no one really knew why it was there. So that knowledge had been lost over the years. So how we retain corporate knowledge of our asset is something that we genuinely take an interest in, because we've seen it time and again of late, where that knowledge of previous events has kind of slipped away over time. So I hope some of that's been interesting. I'm sorry there seems to have been an issue with the sound. I don't really know why. I mean, unfortunately, working from home is that we're at the mercy of my internet connection. So I apologise if you missed some of that. The slides will be up on the PWI website in the coming days, I'm sure. And I'll hand over to Brian. If anyone's got any questions, fire away. My email address is there. If you've got anything you want to talk about at a later date, please feel free to drop me an email.
Well, I have sent a message out for some questions. None have come through yet so far, but there may be a slight delay there. We haven't lost too many, Jonathan, with the, we may have lost 1 or 2 with the sound, but not too many. So got 74 people on board, and we did have 80. So Jimmy Austin wants to ask a question. Do you want to ask it verbally? Do you want to unmute yourself? Doesn't seem to want to.
He says he's on a train, ironically. Ironically, fittingly, I think is that term, Jim. We cover essentially anything that crosses a highway. So we cover narrow gauge. We certainly cover Festiniog and Welsh Highland, which is 2 foot, I think, certainly around 2 foot gauge. And you generally find anything smaller than that is contained in a museum or in kind of self-contained area, a bit of private land. So it doesn't come into scope. So if it crosses a highway, that is the point we take over.
Phil, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, good. Very interesting presentation. Thank you for that. As you say, always many lessons to learn from the unfortunate things that go wrong. I'm intrigued by both the Sheffield and the Eastleigh derailments, both of which I think were components, track components failing, but not, I think, undetected, not picked up through visual inspection, not recognised through any track recording or anything. I'm just wondering, you know, and especially in the context that we're rapidly shifting towards reliance much more on train inspection systems, etc., keeping people off the track, which obviously is a safety benefit in itself. But in that way, you don't have the size 10 boot giving the bolt a kick. I'm just wondering what the thinking is on that at the moment, how we're going to manage that risk.
So with both Eastleigh and Sheffield, for those who don't know, Phil's right, the track components failed, but in both cases they failed in a place that wouldn't be possible to pick up on a visual inspection alone. So the one was a coach screw and the other was a pandrel housing. Both of them failed below the level of the sleeper top. So if you were just looking at it, everything's in place, everything looks normal, but when a train goes over it, there's movement. Now the problem is, unless you've got people on the track, you're not going to see that movement. The only way you can really pick it up from an automated method is to look at dynamic gauge or dynamic track movement. So you're reliant on the track recording vehicles to go over that section. Now, unfortunately, in both cases, for different reasons in each case, but the track recording vehicles weren't traversing these 2 little bits of track. So in the case of Eastleigh, the track recording vehicles went on the straight route on the S&C, and the crossover wasn't recorded separately. And at Sheffield, it's quite a complex station, and this particular route through the station wasn't picked up properly by the MPV, which did the track recording. So in both cases, you've got scenarios there where the track recording trains weren't feeding back this particular bit of track. Now, that's allowed by the standard, by TRK 001, but then you have to go and do it manually. And unfortunately, when you do it manually, you're not getting that dynamic movement. So one of the big questions we're asking Network Rail from both these investigations is, how do you measure track dynamically when you can't run a train over it, or you're not running the track recording train over it. Now, the real answer is make sure the track recording train does everything. But the other problem with the track recording vehicle is there's a low speed cutoff on many of the vehicles. So if the train's travelling at speed through it, no problem, but it's going at a snail's pace because it's a complex junction or because it's just set off from a signal, there's a low speed cutoff where it can't record. And so Network Rail are now looking at that, whether they can make improvements there. So the ball is in Network Rail's court with that at the moment. And I think they're trying to get their heads together to decide what the best way of tackling that challenge is. Does that answer your question, Phil?
Yeah, thank you. It was a very difficult question. I know there's no easy answer, but it's useful to know what the current, what's currently being done to try and address the issue. So thank you for that.
I think the interesting thing I saw some of these areas was a risk assessment to managing old S&C and extra vigilance, and I think that's probably something from the past of the old experienced inspector going back and the person who.
It's a difficult one because while Sheffield was on timber and coach screws, the Eastleigh development was on UIC, NR60 S&C, which was only installed in the last 20 years. So you know, it's not just dilapidated track. It's just, I think we've just got to look at high risk track is probably the best way of looking at it, which feeds into your risk assessment. So areas with high lateral loads and high axle loads, which we're going to put very high lateral forces into the track.
I think we're here for knowledge transfer, and I believe in this very passionately, as you know. And I think, understanding loads and stuff like that by a lot of staff and having more, more training in that sort of area, I think is really important, because some of these loads are quite significant, and perhaps people don't always accept or understand those. Can we just a quick, there's a one answer question just come up here about Stonehaven. I won't ask Steve to ask the question because it's an obvious question. Why is it taking so long, you say?
It's a perfectly valid question. Unfortunately, it is a complex investigation. There's quite a number of different work streams. One of the reasons it's taken quite a while is we've had to go back quite a significant time into the past to look at the asset there, because the big thing here from an engineering perspective, first thing we're looking at is the drain and the earthworks there, and we've had to delve right back to the past. We've dragged people out of retirement. We've had to go to other countries to actually interview people. It's not been an easy tale to tell about the history of the drainage there. Also, we've been looking at the crashworthiness of the stock. We've been looking at things around operation and climate, kind of climate management, and how the signallers and the operation centres reacted. And some of that has been very, very complex, and there's an awful lot gone on behind the scenes which we've not really reported on yet, and is far more complex than I think even we thought it might be when we started this investigation. The other thing as well, this is a multi-agency investigation, so British Transport Police, Police Scotland, the Scottish authorities, so the Office of the Procurator Fiscal, are heavily involved. And where you've got those multi-agency investigations kind of happening side by side, there's very often kind of overlap while you're waiting for other agencies to do things. When, like for instance, the train, we moved the train to Glasgow into storage to have so we could do a full investigation on it, but that has to be done with the police and with the ORR and with the Procurator Fiscal and with the trains owners and maintainers, and those things just take time. The other thing as well, we've got 3 families here who've lost their loved ones, and dealing with those families, we need to be aware of their needs, and sometimes we have to slow things down a bit to make sure that they're properly consulted and properly kept in the loop. So a whole host of reasons why time gets added, basically.
Yeah, thank you for that, Jonathan. Does Rob Mashford want to ask his question verbally?
Yeah, happy to. Hiya. Yeah, it was just around platforms. You sort of mentioned about sort of the London Underground, but on the mainline railway as well, every time we introduce a new train to a route, we have to re-gauge everything, and what appears basically come up with the next least worst gauging solution for that site. Is there anything being done to actually standardise trains? Everyone is different. There's different stepping, different door positions. Causes quite a bit of headache and obviously a massive amount of cost as well to the industry.
Oh yeah, I mean, let's be honest. Gauging is a subject where we could probably spend an entire year's worth of these talks and never quite get around to talking about everything. It really is a very complex area. One of the issues we have, of course, is we've got a very old infrastructure. You know, we've got Victorian infrastructure with lots of things which are less than ideal. And so every train we put on the network, there's a compromise because it has to fit through this tunnel or that curve or this kind of structure clearance here or there. So over time, we've compromised the rolling stock, which in turn compromises new infrastructure, which in turn compromises the next rolling stock. And it's just like a vicious circle. So there is work by RSSB and by the European rail agencies to look at interoperability to make sure the trains coming from the continent can fit on our infrastructure quite easily, and that anything we introduce can fit on theirs, and to try and make it as standardized as we can. The issue is, of course, unless short of ripping up everything and starting again, there's always a compromise we've got to make. Even down to signaling. You go around our network and you've got ERTMS in some places, very few, admittedly. You've got brand new signalling in other places. You've got 4-aspect, 3-aspect, 2-aspect. You've got semaphore still in other places. Track circuits, axle counts. All this means that it's not just gauging. Also, every train's got to be able to work with every signalling system it could potentially have to go through. So this is a massive issue for our industry. And really, as I say, we can't rip it all up and start again. So whenever we introduce something new, we compromise it. And that's infrastructure as well. So we never quite end up with the perfect solution.
That's lovely, thank you.
Sorry, Rob, can you just repeat what you said?
Yeah, no, thank you. That was good. Thank you.
Oh, cheers, Rob.
Okay, I think Tony Elkington wants to ask a question. Do you want to ask your question, Tony? Don't know whether he's got a...
Oh, I can read this question anyway. So
Yeah.
So Tony's asked. Oh, is it there?
I don't know who's there. I'd just like to have another. Dodgy connection. Do you want to go straight in and answer?
For those not looking at the chat, Tony's question is really about corporate memory. We've got a real big thing on this area now. We've seen it a few times in particular of late. We had a derailment at Waterloo a few years back, it'd be about 3 years ago now. And there was some real kind of, for those who remember the Clapham accident, there was an awful lot at the back of our heads as we wrote Waterloo going, this feels an awful lot like Clapham. And that Watford tunnel one I just showed you, we're seeing there with, corporate memory, is it going to be a thing? And of course, we're looking to the future now. Our industry is going to change quite significantly in the next couple of years with Great British Railways coming in. And how we make sure that that transition to a new organisation is as seamless as it can be is going to be of great interest to ourselves and the ORR and indeed every other agency involved. We've seen it on other organisations where there's been a handover from one organisation to another, where records have got lost, where people have changed, and that knowledge has either seeped away or just disappeared overnight. And how we manage that is of great interest. There isn't a single solution, Tony. Even internally at REIB, we look at this and we're kind of doing it our own way, and every organisation does it their own way and slightly differently. So there is, I think, put it this way, I think there's a lot of PhD students who could probably make a fairly decent research project into this, because there doesn't seem to be a perfect way of doing it.
I just want to add to what John said there. The great thing about John's contribution to us is that we continuously looking at the alerts, we're continuously discussing them at technical board, we're discussing them with the training team, with a bit of, with a hope that we can do our bit as a PWI with presentations like today, we're going to go into some more details of some of these stuff later on, and also, you know, in making sure that we cover some of this stuff on our training courses. We just got time for one last question, and I won't ask him to Sankardev Chowdhury. He just wants an update. Do we have an update on the Salisbury Tunnel incident?
So it's still an ongoing investigation. It's not one I'm directly involved with, so I can't really speak to the intricacies of what we've found yet, because I genuinely don't know myself. I mean, what I can tell you is obviously the facts of the day that we reported on quite quickly. 2 trains entering that kind of Y junction going into the tunnel, and one train was travelling into the tunnel. The other train was meant to stop at a signal, and due to low adhesion, basically went straight through the signal and then hit the first train on the side swipe. So that's what happened. And as to why it happened, I'm afraid I don't have that information myself.
Okay. Well, that's brilliant. I'm going to summarise now, but thank you very much. I'm sure you'll be in touch. You've got John's email address there, and I know he's keen when he gets released from COVID to go around the country and talk to people and all the rest of it, and we can pass on, you know, our experiences and everything like that. I think it's been a good session. Thank you very much, John. Thanks very much for putting that together. And you know, the whole purpose of this exercise to learn from the past. Hopefully, we should be preventing accidents. But every time there's an accident, it's a big learning point. And if you look at the way that the railway's developed over 150 plus years, it's always been about how can we make things better, how can we make them work again. So it's a great organisation, very hands-on, very supportive, and on behalf of the PWI and everybody who's been on the call today, I thank you very much, John. Thank you for putting the time out. Thank you for surviving an hour without coughing, which I think is quite impressive. So anyway, thank you very much, everybody. We've still got 58 people here. Don't forget PWI, the PWI.org. Look on the website and look at next week and have a look at what we've got planned for the next couple of weeks, etc. on the Lunch and Learn. Thank you for supporting the PWI. Thank you for coming along today, and I really, really hope you've enjoyed it. And we'll have quite a few more of these going forward. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a good rest of the afternoon.